The house in Bustleton stood as a symbol of stability, nestled on a quiet street where neighbors often waved and exchanged pleasantries. Vladimir Ussachevsky and Lola Karavaeva were the kind of couple everyone envied. Married for almost 20 years, they had created a life many dreamed of, a well-kept home, good jobs, and no signs of trouble. To anyone on the outside, they were the perfect couple. But as the years passed, cracks began to form beneath the surface. What appeared to be a picture-perfect marriage was anything but. Lola had recently returned from a trip, and Ussachevsky had seemed more distant than usual. The small talk they had shared in the days leading up to her disappearance was tinged with something unsettling. He had always been the quiet type, but lately there was an eerie tension between them. She had begun spending more time outside of the house, often leaving for weekends away. But something about this last trip felt different. On Saturday morning, Lola returned home early. A brief exchange with the neighbor confirmed her arrival, but as the day wore on, it became clear that something was amiss. By Sunday evening, she had vanished without a trace. Ussachevsky, as expected, acted the part of a concerned husband, but his calm, controlled demeanor didn't seem to match the circumstances. When the neighbors asked if they could help search, he responded curtly, brushing them off with a vague excuse. But there was something about the way he avoided eye contact and didn't seem worried that caused a ripple of doubt to form. The next day, police were called. Ussachevsky, despite his initial calm, was now visibly anxious. He claimed that he hadn't seen Lola all day Sunday. He told the police that she had left him a note about going away again. The officer, still skeptical, asked if he had seen her leave the house. Ussachevsky simply said, "No, but she's always gone on these trips without telling anyone." The investigation began with the obvious assumption. Perhaps Lola had gone somewhere without leaving a trace. But as the day stretched on and no sign of her appeared, the unease that had slowly been building took a darker turn. Her friends began to call, concerned about the sudden silence. They hadn't heard from her, and her absence felt out of character. Still, there was no sign of Lola. Ussachevsky's story was consistent, but there was something cold about his detachment. No real concern in his voice, no panic. It was as if he had already resigned himself to the idea that she was gone. The police were starting to get suspicious. Days passed. No calls, no messages, and no sign of Lola. It wasn't until later that week when the worst of all possible discoveries came. But for now, the silence was deafening. And in the midst of it all, Vladimir Ussachevsky walked through the days without a care, as if this was just another brief absence in the life of a married couple. But this was no ordinary absence. The cracks that had appeared in their marriage were about to shatter everything, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the days passed since Lola Karavaeva's return from her trip, her absence became more pronounced. What began as a brief worry from friends and neighbors soon spiraled into full-blown concern. By Sunday evening, the realization settled in. Lola was truly missing. Her phone, usually buzzing with calls and texts, was silent. Her personal belongings remained in their usual places, except for the things she took with her on her trip. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced doors or windows. It was as if she had simply vanished. Vladimir Ussachevsky seemed unfazed. Neighbors saw him occasionally pacing in and out of the house, as if checking on things, but not once did he seem genuinely distraught. He reassured those around him, claiming that Lola must have gone out of town again without leaving word, a habit she had apparently adopted in recent months. But something about his tone felt off, too calm, too rehearsed. "Have you heard from her? She didn't tell us she was leaving again," one of the neighbors asked, concern heavy in her voice. "No," Ussachevsky replied flatly. "She must have just gone off again. She does that sometimes." The words felt hollow. As time passed, however, the doubt began to seep in. Ussachevsky's behavior didn't match the urgency of the situation. When the police arrived at their home on Monday morning, Ussachevsky appeared almost relieved, but his cold demeanor only deepened the suspicion. The officer, trying to piece together the timeline, pressed him for more details. "When was the last time you saw her, Mr. Ussachevsky?" "Saturday morning," he answered without hesitation. "She came home from her trip early, we spoke for a bit, and I went about my day." The officer glanced at the clock. Saturday was 2 full days ago. Still, no one had heard from Lola, and the signs of her sudden departure didn't seem to add up. Have you checked around? Maybe she's just... I told you, Ussachevsky cut in. She's probably off somewhere. I'm sure she's fine. But the more the officer probed, the more Ussachevsky's responses began to feel rehearsed, almost like he was trying to maintain control of the narrative. His lack of real emotion, his reluctance to engage, seemed at odds with the situation. He wasn't angry, worried, or even upset. He was calm, and it was unsettling. Lola's friends began calling more frequently. Have you heard from her? Is everything okay? Their questions echoed in Ussachevsky's mind, but he had no answers. Only the same cold reassurance that Lola was just fine. The world outside his home seemed to spin with worry, but inside, Ussachevsky remained distant, his emotions locked away behind a wall of indifference. As the hours turned to days, the police continued their search. A missing persons report was filed, but with every passing hour, the chances of finding Lola alive dwindled. The investigation began, but with each turn, the officers found more questions than answers. By Tuesday morning, the situation had shifted. No longer was this just a missing persons case. This was a puzzle with too many pieces out of place, and Ussachevsky's calm demeanor had begun to turn from a sign of composure into something much darker. It wasn't long before the suspicions surrounding his actions and words grew into something undeniable. But still he held firm. He wouldn't break. He couldn't break. As the investigation deepened, the truth seemed closer than ever. But Ussachevsky's silence grew louder with each passing moment. The silence in the house was deafening. Lola Karavaeva's absence had become more than just a mystery. It was a shadow hanging over everything. Her disappearance didn't make sense, and the investigation seemed to be going in circles. But for the police, there was one thing that had become increasingly clear. Vladimir Ussachevsky knew more than he was letting on. For all his calmness, there was something unsettling about the way he had carried himself. He didn't seem scared or anxious. He didn't seem like a man whose wife had gone missing. He was a man who was either hiding something or completely detached from reality. As investigators dug deeper into the case, Ussachevsky's behavior remained a puzzle. Days passed, and still, no sign of Lola. The search grew more desperate, but with each passing hour, the hope of finding her alive dwindled. The police kept pressing Ussachevsky, but he remained composed, almost too composed. He was careful with his words, dodging the most direct questions about Lola's whereabouts. But something wasn't adding up. A breakthrough came when the police got their hands on the home surveillance footage. It was the key piece they had been missing. The footage showed Lola returning home on Saturday morning, as Ussachevsky had said. But it also showed him, in a rare moment of vulnerability, leaving the house several times during the day. His comings and goings seemed ordinary, but the more they looked at the footage, the more it felt like something was being hidden. One crucial moment stood out. At one point, Ussachevsky was seen loading something large into the trunk of his car, but the camera angle couldn't catch exactly what it was. He didn't appear to be in a rush. He moved methodically, almost as if he was trying to make sure no one noticed. Then another moment. Later that evening, Ussachevsky returned home, but there was a strange look in his eyes, something cold, distant, as if the man who had been seen earlier that day wasn't the same person anymore. The police couldn't shake the feeling that they were being misled. They dug into his phone records. There were multiple calls to an unknown number, some late into the night. The connections were becoming too obvious. They decided to follow up on the leads, but Ussachevsky, when asked about the calls, dismissed it casually. Just old friends. I don't see the need for you to look into that. But the police did look into it. They traced the number. The owner of it was someone Ussachevsky had been in contact with for years, an ex-lover from his past, someone who had disappeared from his life years ago. As they dug deeper, they found a troubling connection. The same person had been in contact with Ussachevsky just before and after Lola's disappearance. It was clear now. Ussachevsky had been hiding more than just his emotions. He had been hiding the truth. When confronted, he seemed to lose his cool for the first time in days. His carefully crafted demeanor cracked. He stammered, his usual calm slipping. I don't understand what you want from me. She left. She must have gone off again. I don't know. But the police weren't buying it anymore. The more they examined his behavior, the more contradictions they found. Ussachevsky's story about Lola's sudden disappearance began to sound more like a cover-up, and with every new discovery, they found themselves piecing together a darker picture, one where Ussachevsky had more than just a hand in his wife's disappearance. He had orchestrated it. The investigation had now shifted from a missing persons case to something far more sinister. What had started as a quiet, methodical man with an untarnished reputation was now being revealed as someone much more dangerous. Ussachevsky's calm was not the demeanor of a man who had lost his wife. It was the demeanor of someone hiding a deadly secret, and the truth was just beginning to surface. The investigation had reached a boiling point. With every passing hour, the walls were closing in around Vladimir Ussachevsky, and his calm, composed facade was beginning to fracture. He had been adamant, almost rehearsed in his defense. Lola had gone off somewhere, perhaps on another spontaneous trip. She'd done it before, so why not now? But the police weren't convinced. The breakthrough came when they uncovered Ussachevsky's phone records. The calls to an unknown number became a focal point. At first, he denied knowing anything about it, insisting they were just old acquaintances, friends from the past. But the more the police dug, the more the pieces didn't fit. The person on the other end of the line? Someone Ussachevsky had been involved with years ago. An ex-lover whose existence he had never mentioned to anyone, not even to Lola. The investigators couldn't ignore the obvious connection. Ussachevsky had spent the days leading up to Lola's disappearance in constant communication with someone who had been out of his life for years. But it wasn't just that. This person had been in contact shortly before and after Lola's return. The pieces were starting to form a clearer picture, one that Ussachevsky's perfect life couldn't hide any longer. When the police confronted him with this new evidence, Ussachevsky's calm began to falter. He looked at them with narrowed eyes, trying to hold on to the story he had so carefully constructed. "I don't know why you're looking into that. It's nothing," he said, his voice steady but lacking its earlier confidence. His words, though, were like a thin veneer, ready to crack under pressure. But the pressure only increased. The officers laid out the facts, his lies, his evasions, the strange calls, and his suspicious behavior. And then there was the surveillance footage. The images of him loading something large into the trunk of his car, a clear indication that he was hiding something he didn't want anyone to see. Still, Ussachevsky tried to deny it. He said it was nothing more than a regular trip to the store, nothing worth mentioning. But the look on his face betrayed him. It wasn't fear exactly, but something darker, something more desperate. The police were relentless. They pressed him again and again, peeling back the layers of his story, revealing cracks in the facade. And with each new revelation, Ussachevsky's denials grew weaker. His earlier calm gave way to a slow unraveling. The lies were too many. The evidence was too strong. Then came the breaking point. Under the weight of the evidence and the relentless questioning, Ussachevsky finally snapped. His composed exterior collapsed, and for the first time, he admitted to the police that he knew more than he had let on. But the confession was not a full one. No, it was a half-hearted attempt to justify his actions. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice cracking, his hands shaking. "She was going to leave me, and I didn't know what to do. I thought if I just stopped her." But the words hung in the air, hollow and unsettling. There was no true remorse in his voice, only a mixture of guilt and anger. Anger that his life, the perfect life he had so carefully curated, was slipping away. The truth had caught up with him. As the confession hung heavy in the room, the detectives took in the weight of his words. They didn't need him to say more. His actions had already spoken volumes. Lola Karavaeva was gone, and her life had been stolen from her in a brutal, calculated moment of rage. Ussachevsky sat in silence. The truth finally laid bare. His denial had crumbled, and with it, the carefully constructed world he had tried to keep intact. But the damage was done, and there was no escaping the consequences. The case was no longer just about a missing wife. It was about a man who had killed to hold on to his control, his illusion of a perfect life. And in that moment, it became clear that nothing could restore what he had destroyed. The deeper the investigation went, the darker Ussachevsky's past became. What had seemed like a mild-mannered man with a simple life was now unraveling to reveal a history of hidden demons. Investigators had started to peel back the layers of Ussachevsky's life, and what they found was not the quiet, unassuming man he portrayed himself to be. He had been living with a mask for years, hiding his true self from the world, and most importantly, from his wife, Lola. The first revelation came from a seemingly innocent source, Ussachevsky's work colleagues. To them, he had always been polite, if not a bit reserved. But one woman, an old colleague who had worked with him in his earlier years, came forward with unsettling information. She had known Ussachevsky during his first marriage, long before Lola entered the picture. According to her, Ussachevsky had been controlling even then. The first wife had walked away from the marriage after years of manipulation and emotional abuse. He had always been good at keeping up appearances, well-liked, quiet, but there were whispers of anger that would flare up when things didn't go his way. He had been possessive, unwilling to let go, just as he had done with Lola. This wasn't the first time he tried to control someone, the woman said, her voice shaking with the weight of the truth. He was always good at hiding it, but it was there, underneath. I don't think anyone ever really saw what was behind those eyes. This piece of the puzzle was enough to send investigators digging deeper into Ussachevsky's past. They found more disturbing details. His ex-wife had sought therapy after their separation, but nothing had ever been reported to the authorities. There were no police records, no accusations. He had never been officially violent, but his presence, his influence, had always loomed large. The investigation also uncovered financial strain between Ussachevsky and Lola, though it was never openly discussed. Over time, Lola had begun confiding in friends about her desire to leave the marriage. She had been planning an escape. The money that had been set aside was not just for a rainy day, it was her ticket out. She had told a close friend that she was afraid of what Ussachevsky might do if she ever tried to leave him. But she had no choice. The life she had been living, the constant undercurrent of control, was suffocating. Despite all this, Ussachevsky had managed to keep his dark side well hidden. To most, he was still the quiet, dependable neighbor, the man who went about his days without causing any trouble. But behind the scenes, Lola had been preparing to break free. And that, more than anything, was the catalyst for what happened next. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to connect the dots between Ussachevsky's past actions and the murder of Lola. There were too many similarities, too many red flags. Ussachevsky's controlling nature had not just driven him to silence his wife's desires for freedom, it had pushed him to commit the unthinkable. He had gone too far this time, and the web of lies was beginning to tighten around him. One evening, as Ussachevsky sat in his quiet home, the reality began to set in. The investigators had uncovered more than he thought they would. His past, his carefully guarded secrets, were no longer his to control. He had spent years building a life of deceit, but now the truth was pouring out, and there was no way to stop it. But despite the mounting evidence, Ussachevsky refused to crack. He remained calm, as if he were still the one in control. His denial was the last defense he had left. Yet as more pieces of his past came to light, it became increasingly clear. The man who had once lived under the illusion of a perfect marriage was now exposed for who he truly was. A man capable of anything to maintain his hold over the ones he loved, and the ones he claimed to care about most. Vladimir Ussachevsky's carefully crafted story was beginning to unravel at an alarming pace. What had started as a missing persons case had now escalated into something far more sinister. The police had uncovered layers of deception, each one more troubling than the last. But Ussachevsky was not ready to let go of the facade he had built over the years. His denial was now his only defense, and he clung to it with a desperate intensity. The discovery of his phone records had already shaken the case, but the detectives weren't done. They found more. Ussachevsky had been communicating with his ex-lover in the weeks leading up to Lola's disappearance. The woman had returned to his life at a time when Lola was planning to leave him. The police couldn't ignore the coincidence, and Ussachevsky's repeated insistence that he was simply reconnecting with an old friend rang hollow. You've been in contact with her for months, one of the detectives pressed, his voice steady but firm. This isn't just some chance encounter. This is calculated. Ussachevsky shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. He had spent days weaving a story that he thought would protect him. But with each new piece of evidence, his web of lies grew more fragile. I didn't want her to know, Ussachevsky muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt her. She didn't deserve to find out this way. The detective leaned in, his gaze unflinching. So you admit you were hiding the truth from her? Hiding your connection to this woman? Ussachevsky's shoulders slumped. He wasn't prepared for this. The pressure was mounting, but he still couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge what had happened. I, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted things to stay the way they were. The detectives knew that Ussachevsky's words were just another fabrication. They had already uncovered the financial strain, the arguments, and the manipulation. It was clear now, Ussachevsky had been desperately trying to maintain control over Lola's life. And when it became apparent that she was ready to leave him, he had resorted to violence to stop her. But the more Ussachevsky spoke, the more cracks appeared in his story. He tried to distance himself from the details, claiming that Lola's death had been an accident, a moment of lost control. But the evidence told a different story, a story of premeditation, of a man who had carefully planned the murder of the woman who had wanted to break free from his grip. Ussachevsky's hands shook as he spoke. His voice trembled when he described the last moments he had with Lola. She was going to leave me. She told me she was done. She was going to go, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose her. The police listened, but they knew better. The remorse in his voice was just another layer of the deception. It wasn't guilt that drove him to confess. It was the crushing realization that the life he had built was slipping away, and there was no way to hold on to it anymore. You didn't love her, the detective said coldly. You wanted to control her, and when you couldn't, you killed her. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Ussachevsky's eyes were wide, but there was no denying the truth. He had killed Lola, not in a fit of rage, but with calculated intent. He had chosen to end her life, to end her plans for freedom, all because he couldn't bear the thought of losing his control over her. The confession didn't come easily, but it was inevitable. Ussachevsky's fabricated truth had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The police now had him cornered, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. As the detectives prepared to move forward with the case, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disbelief. How had they not seen it sooner? How had Ussachevsky managed to deceive everyone around him for so long? The man they had once considered a quiet, harmless neighbor was now revealed as a cold-blooded killer, hiding behind a wall of lies and manipulation. For Ussachevsky, there was no turning back. The fabricated truth had been exposed, and with it, the man he had tried so desperately to protect had been laid bare for the world to see. The investigation had already uncovered more than enough to convict Vladimir Ussachevsky. His attempts to conceal the truth, his web of lies, and the mounting evidence against him had all but sealed his fate. Yet as the case began to draw closer to a resolution, a final revelation emerged, one that would change the course of the investigation entirely. Detectives had spent days poring over every detail of Ussachevsky's life, from his communications with his ex-lover to the surveillance footage of his strange behavior the day Lola disappeared. But as they pieced together the last pieces of the puzzle, they discovered something that even they hadn't anticipated. Ussachevsky's manipulation wasn't confined to just his wife. A witness, someone from Ussachevsky's past, came forward, a former friend who had known him long before Lola entered the picture. This person revealed a chilling detail. Ussachevsky had been involved in an altercation years ago, one that had been covered up by the authorities, a crime so horrific that it had been buried to protect his reputation. In this revelation, it became clear that Ussachevsky was not simply a man driven by love and jealousy. No, he was someone whose violent tendencies had been concealed for years, buried beneath the image of a respectable man. The witness recalled a time when Ussachevsky had nearly killed someone over a minor disagreement. someone who had later mysteriously disappeared. At the time, it had seemed like an isolated incident, but now in the context of Lola's death, it painted an entirely different picture. The police dove deeper, revisiting old cases, and soon uncovered that this incident wasn't the only time Ussachevsky had been involved in questionable behavior. There had been other reports, small incidents, slightly unsettling, but never enough to warrant investigation. However, this new information about his violent past, combined with the murder of Lola, revealed a darker pattern that had been buried for too long. As Ussachevsky sat in the interrogation room, he was hit with the full weight of his past. The detectives confronted him with the truth, his history of violence, the hidden secrets, and the lies he had told for so many years. But still he resisted. He maintained his innocence, insisting that his actions were justified, that he had been driven to madness by Lola's betrayal. "You don't understand," Ussachevsky said, his voice trembling. "She was going to leave me. She was going to ruin everything I had worked for. I couldn't let that happen. I loved her too much to let her walk away." But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that Ussachevsky's love had never been unconditional. It had always been a love built on control, on manipulation, and on the need to possess. His confession, as incomplete as it was, revealed the truth of his psyche. He had killed Lola not because he loved her, but because he couldn't bear the thought of losing his grip on her. The police were no longer just dealing with the murder of a woman. They were dealing with a man whose entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. His marriage to Lola had been nothing more than another act of control, a way for him to maintain his position of power. She had become a possession, something to be held on to at all costs. The final revelation was devastating. Ussachevsky's past had been a shadow hanging over everything, and now it had caught up with him. The man who had once been seen as quiet, unassuming, and trustworthy was now revealed as someone capable of unspeakable violence. The case, which had started with a missing person, had now become a chilling portrait of a man who had concealed his true nature for far too long. As Ussachevsky was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions finally began to sink in. Lola Karavaeva had been a victim, not just of a crime of passion, but of years of manipulation, control, and abuse. Her death had been the tragic culmination of a relationship built on lies, and in the end, Ussachevsky's past had been the key to unlocking the truth. For Lola's family, the revelation was both a relief and a heartbreaking reminder of everything that had been lost. The truth had finally come to light, but it was far too late to bring her back. The room was silent, the kind of silence that hung heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Vladimir Ussachevsky sat across from the detectives, his eyes darting between the investigators, trying to hold on to whatever control he had left. He had resisted for so long, clinging to his fabricated story, his defense mechanisms running on empty. The past few days had been a blur of interrogations, evidence, and the slow, steady unraveling of his lies. But now, in the face of mounting evidence, he had nowhere left to hide. "You've been lying to us, Mr. Ussachevsky," one of the detectives said, his voice calm but firm. "We know what happened. We know what you did." Ussachevsky shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping to the table. He couldn't meet their eyes anymore. The truth was no longer something he could deny. He had lived in the darkness for so long, hiding his true self behind a mask of civility, that the light of reality was blinding him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want to hurt her. I loved her." The words, though spoken with apparent regret, felt hollow. The detectives had heard the same story over and over, but they knew better. His love had never been unconditional. It had been possessive, controlling, and ultimately destructive. The evidence spoke for itself. The financial strain, the emotional manipulation, the lies. These were the true markers of Ussachevsky's love. He continued, his voice breaking as he tried to explain himself. "She was going to leave me. She told me she wanted to go. She was going to take everything. I couldn't let her. I couldn't lose her." The detectives exchanged a glance, knowing that this confession, in its own twisted way, was the first crack in Ussachevsky's facade. It wasn't a full confession, not yet, but it was the beginning of his collapse. I wasn't thinking clearly. I I didn't know what to do, so I He paused, taking a shaky breath, his hands trembling. I just snapped. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The tension in the room was palpable. Ussachevsky's voice faltered, his words growing weaker as the weight of his actions began to settle in. He had been trying to hold on to his version of the story for so long, but the truth had begun to chip away at it. He had wanted to control Lola's life, control her decisions, her future, and in the end, her death. You didn't snap, the detective said, his voice steady. You planned it. You knew exactly what you were doing, and when you couldn't control her anymore, you killed her. The words hit Ussachevsky like a punch to the gut. He winced, but it wasn't the pain that got to him. It was the reality of what had happened. He had taken a life. He had killed the woman he claimed to love, not out of a momentary loss of control, but out of fear of losing the power he had over her. I was scared, Ussachevsky admitted quietly, the admission hanging in the air like a confession. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't live without her. The detectives didn't flinch. They had seen it all before. The emotional breakdowns, the excuses, the justifications. But what Ussachevsky didn't realize was that it wasn't fear of loss that had driven him to kill. It was the fear of losing control. He hadn't killed her out of love. He had killed her out of obsession, desperation, and a need to maintain dominance. I thought if I just kept her with me, everything would go back to normal. He continued, his voice barely audible now. But it was already too late. I couldn't fix what I'd already broken. For a brief moment, Ussachevsky looked lost. Lost in his own words, lost in the chaos he had created. His confession wasn't filled with remorse. It wasn't an apology. It was a man trying to justify the unforgivable. The detectives let the silence linger, letting Ussachevsky stew in the weight of his own confession. They had heard enough. They knew what had happened. And now, with his admission, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. His confession was incomplete, messy, and emotionally charged. But it was a confession nonetheless, and it marked the beginning of the end for Vladimir Ussachevsky. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the true face of the man who had once seemed so ordinary. A man capable of murder, driven not by love, but by an all-consuming need to control. As the detectives prepared to leave the room, one of them glanced back at Ussachevsky, who sat there staring into nothingness. You'll be held accountable for this, the detective said softly, his words final. Ussachevsky nodded slowly as if accepting the inevitable, and as the door closed behind him, the weight of his actions hung in the air, heavy, undeniable, and irreversible. The courtroom was filled with a heavy sense of anticipation. The once quiet, unassuming Vladimir Ussachevsky now sat before a judge, facing the consequences of his actions. The trial had begun, and with it came the painful revelation of what had truly happened behind closed doors. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. The evidence was undeniable. Ussachevsky's lies, his manipulations, and the chilling confession he had made under pressure painted a clear picture. Lola Karavaeva had not just been the victim of a random act of violence, she had been the victim of a man who had slowly, over time, twisted their marriage into a prison from which she had tried to escape. You hear the facts, the evidence, the prosecutor began, his voice cutting through the air with authority. The defendant, Vladimir Ussachevsky, manipulated and controlled his wife for years. When he realized she was ready to leave him, when he realized she had found a way out, he made the decision to take her life. He took the life of a woman who simply wanted freedom. The room was silent as the prosecutor laid out the timeline. The financial difficulties, the emotional abuse, the sudden disappearances, the lies, all of it came rushing back to the jury. Each detail reinforced the prosecution's argument that Ussachevsky had been methodical, calculating. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a planned execution of a woman who no longer fit into his vision of control. But the defense was prepared. They were not ready to concede defeat. Ussachevsky's lawyer stood, his presence commanding as he began his counterarguments. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've heard today is a story, a narrative, the defense attorney said, his tone measured. But this is not the whole truth. My client, Vladimir Ussachevsky, never intended for any of this to happen. What you've heard about Lola's plans to leave him, those were never fully realized. What we're dealing with here is a tragedy, a man caught in the throes of emotional turmoil, his mind clouded by desperation. The defense tried to argue that Ussachevsky's actions were not premeditated, but the prosecutor wasn't buying it. The case was strong, and the jury could sense the tension between the two sides. You're telling us that this was an accident, the prosecutor challenged, pointing at Ussachevsky, that the life of a woman was taken by a man so desperate he couldn't control his emotions? Number, what happened here was calculated. You can't deny it, Mr. Ussachevsky. The courtroom watched as Ussachevsky remained still, his face impassive. But behind his eyes there was a flicker, a sign of the unraveling man he had become. His once calm demeanor, which had fooled so many, was now a distant memory. In the audience, Lola's family sat quietly, their faces a mixture of grief and anger. They had spent months waiting for this moment, the moment when justice would finally be served. And while the evidence was clear, the emotional toll was undeniable. The woman they had loved, the woman who had been torn away too soon, was now only a memory. And the man who had taken her from them was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The defense tried to play on emotions, suggesting that Ussachevsky was not a violent man, but simply a victim of his circumstances, a man unable to handle the thought of losing his wife. But the prosecutor wasn't swayed. Control, obsession, manipulation, these are the traits of a man who doesn't just lose his temper. These are the traits of a man who will stop at nothing to retain what he believes is his. Ussachevsky's desire to control Lola, to keep her in his grasp, ultimately led to her death. With each word, Ussachevsky's image cracked further. No longer was he the quiet, reserved neighbor. Now he was being exposed as a man whose jealousy, anger, and need for dominance had led to murder. As the prosecutor rested his case, Ussachevsky's defense attorney prepared for his final rebuttal, but it was clear the damage had been done. The courtroom had been gripped by the undeniable evidence of Ussachevsky's guilt. Lola's family, while silent, felt the weight of every word, every piece of evidence. Their grief was palpable, but so was their resolve. They had lived through the nightmare of her disappearance, and now they would see justice served. The judge called for a short recess before the closing arguments, but the room remained tense, thick with the tension of a case that was so close to its inevitable conclusion. Ussachevsky sat quietly, his thoughts racing. But there was no escape now. No more lies, no more pretending. The truth had won. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. The jury had deliberated, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Vladimir Ussachevsky, who had sat stoically through the trial, his emotions locked behind a calm facade, now awaited the judgment that would forever change his life. The weight of the entire case, the broken pieces of a life, hung in the air as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Lola Karavaeva's family sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and quiet resolve. They had endured the torturous wait for justice, months of uncertainty, months of wondering if they would ever see the truth come to light. Today, they would finally know the outcome. Ussachevsky's defense team had done all they could to plant seeds of doubt, attempting to portray him as a victim of his emotions, a man who had been pushed too far. But the prosecution's case had been undeniable. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, had pointed to one conclusion. Vladimir Ussachevsky had killed his wife in a cold, calculated attempt to control her and prevent her from leaving him. The jury returned to the courtroom, and the room held its breath. Ussachevsky straightened in his seat, his fingers nervously tapping the table. His lawyer sat beside him, tense but maintaining composure. Across the room, Lola's family sat with hands clasped, waiting for what seemed like an eternity. The judge looked over the jury's decision. His gaze lingered on the paper for a moment longer than necessary before he stood, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he delivered the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Vladimir Ussachevsky, guilty of the first-degree murder of Lola Karavaeva." A collective exhale passed through the room. Lola's family, though not surprised by the outcome, allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. The truth had prevailed, and the man who had taken their beloved daughter, sister, and friend was finally being held accountable for his actions. Ussachevsky's face remained impassive, but the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers clutched the armrest, betrayed the crushing weight of the moment. He had spent months, no, years, building a life around lies. Now that life had crumbled, and the price he would pay was a life sentence behind bars. The judge's voice cut through the tension, the finality of his words hanging in the air. Mr. Ussachevsky, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words echoed in the courtroom. Ussachevsky's lawyer stood beside him, his face a mask of professional indifference. Ussachevsky, for a moment, seemed to falter, his eyes briefly meeting those of the judge. But no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement passed between them. In the back of the courtroom, Lola's family felt a quiet sense of closure. It would never bring her back, of course, but it was justice, and it was what they had fought for. The man who had torn their lives apart, who had controlled, manipulated, and ultimately killed the woman they loved, would now face the consequences of his actions. Lola's mother, tears silently streaming down her face, leaned into her husband for support. She had never stopped hoping for this day, never stopped believing that one day they would get justice for their daughter. Now it had come, but as Ussachevsky was led away in handcuffs, there was an undeniable emptiness. Justice had been served, but the damage had already been done. Lola would never come back. She would never walk through the door again, laughing at a private joke, telling a story, or offering her kind, warm presence. The courtroom slowly emptied, the noise of everyday life returning. But for those who had been touched by this tragedy, the echoes of Lola's loss would remain. The final verdict had been rendered, but the real consequences of Ussachevsky's actions would linger far longer than any prison sentence ever could. As Ussachevsky was escorted out of the courtroom, his face blank, his future uncertain, the truth was clear. No matter how much he had tried to control, no matter how many lies he had told, the reality of his actions had finally come home, and the world would never forget the name of the woman he had taken. Lola Karavaeva, who had dreamed of freedom but was never given the chance to escape. What do you think of Vladimir Ussachevsky's actions and the shocking revelation behind his wife's death? Do you believe the confession was an act of remorse or just a last attempt to justify his actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more true crime stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for more gripping investigations.